Hi, Chloe.
Nicole, can we start? Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to some from the US. My name is Musa Hadi. I'll be chairing this session. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for our second webinar of the Ubuntu series. This project, as you've noticed, has been funded by the Mellon Foundation. It's a joint partnership between Michigan State as well as the university, Stellenbosch University. And the principal investigators for this project is Jamie Manson, the director of the African Studies Center and a professor of history, as well as Bongani Ungijima, who is the director of the Stellenbosch Museum, University Museum. So please welcome to this Ubuntu webinar series. I think the main aim of the project really is to decolonize the museum. And I think Bongani, who's the director of the Stellenbosch University Museum, as well as Jenny, really the aim with this project is to create a vibrant site for museums, a space where people can engage and think about museum as a different space. Really, it's a decolonization in practice. It's what the aim of this series is about. Today, I am humbled and honored because I have two of very important speakers, I would say. One of them is Professor John Mason, and the other one is Dr. Luvuyo Dondolo. And John teaches African history and the history of photography at the Department of History at the University of Virginia. He co-directs the university's Holsinger Portrait Project, a multimedia initiative which explores the neglected history of Black Virginians through studio portraits of them that were made a century ago. Manson has published 2 books on South African history, Social Death and Resurrection, Slavery and Emancipation in South Africa, and One Love, Gomer Beat, and Inside the Cape Town Carnival, which he brought together history, ethnography, and his own documentary, and part of that. And Luvuyo holds a PhD in social science. He was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. He also recently published a book called The Afrocentric Turn in African Heritage Studies in Africa, Epistemology of Alterity, which advocates for decolonization of heritage studies in Africa. He is also the director of the Center for Transdisciplinary Studies at the University of Fort Hare. He was also a council member of the Gauteng Provincial Heritage Authority. We'll start with John. I mean, the CV is so immense. So this is like a brief sort of a snippet. I'm not even doing justice to the CV already. But we'll start with John. John will be presenting on garden parks, a Harlem family, and the limits of empathy. He has about 25 minutes, and then Luvuyo will be presenting on the reflections of Ubuntu philosophy and the historical geography of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. So also he will have about 25 minutes to 30 minutes. Then I'll give Rady roughly about 2 minutes to 5 minutes at best. Just the opening remarks before Q&A, what I think the themes and the synergy between the two papers are all about. So I'll hand it over to John for about 25 minutes, then we'll then immediately proceed to Luvuyo thereafter.
Good, well, thank you very much. And I'm really delighted to be here. The first thing I always do before I start speaking is to set my timer on my phone. So you'll excuse me while I do that, because I am a professor and we do like to talk. So let me share my screen. And say that I am talking about Gordon Parks, an African-American photographer who flourished during the middle of the 20th century. He is, by any accounting, one of the great photographers of the 20th century. His images are collected by museums, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. He's had exhibitions in the United States and throughout the world. Parks is an immensely important figure. I'm writing a book about him. I'll make the argument that his photographs and the texts, the stories that he published in Life magazine made him one of the most important interpreters of African-American experience during the middle years of the 20th century. I'm looking at one particular photo essay that he published in Life magazine, A Harlem Family. As you will see, it was the story of a deeply impoverished Harlem family. When I was invited to join the Ubuntu dialogues, I said, well, I feel like an interloper because I don't know anything about Ubuntu except what I learned from Desmond Tutu. And I don't study Ubuntu, and it's not something that I use as an analytical tool. And I was assured, well, that's fine, you'll fit in anyway. Well, this particular photo essay, Parks goes after something akin to Ubuntu. And this photo essay is from 52 years ago, 1968. And the word Ubuntu certainly wasn't in circulation in the United States. I'm sure he had never heard it. But he goes after something that's beyond empathy, and I do think is akin to Ubuntu. So this is the photo essay that I'll be talking about. It's published in Life magazine in March 1968. It actually begins on the cover. The child who seems to be crying in this photo essay is one of the children of the family that Parks worked with. And as you can see, it was a difficult experience for him. And nevertheless, it was in many ways a tremendously successful photo essay. It did move the hearts of his readers, which is exactly what he wanted to do. It moved them to empathy, but it had its limitations. And its limitations were in the way that he stripped the family of any social context. He stripped them of whatever agency they might have. And the photo essay was an open invitation to white saviorism. And that's something that Life's readers, Life's millions of readers, millions of middle-class readers, millions of middle-class white readers, they eagerly embraced the opportunity to become white saviors for this family. Excuse me. So there's a context for this photo essay. It comes from the urban uprisings in Black communities all over the country during the 1960s. They were at the time referred to as riots. uprising is probably a better word. And there was a question. America was on edge. Remember that we were mired in the war in Vietnam, which many Americans increasingly saw as unjust and unwinnable. And it was also the civil rights movements had come to a sticking point. And these uprisings were driven by anger and frustration at the continuation of racism and white supremacy in the United States. People were deeply concerned about why they were happening, and Parks wanted to answer. And as he says here, that he wanted to take his readers into the experience of poverty, to show them the horror of it. And he did with great effectiveness. Now, this is the opening spread and the photo essay, the 2-page spread. And I'll talk about this at length, but what he's doing on the left is offering his readers, he was always very conscious that they were mostly white readers. He was offering his white readers something akin to Ubuntu. That's not obvious in the large text, but it becomes clear in the small text that he is challenging them, but he's also offering out his hand. He's offering a vision of a better America. The photograph is of the father of the family, Norman Fontenelle. You can see that it's not one of those crystal clear documentary photographs. It doesn't reveal its meaning easily. You know, and Parks said that he wasn't after crystal clear documentary. What he was after was a mood. And so what follows from this opening poetic kind of moment is a kind of montage of text and photographs that create a mood rather than a narrative or argue a point. They do not argue a point. I said it was tremendously successful. It was in many ways. And Life's readers sent hundreds of letters to the editor and to Parks himself. I've read them all. They're in his archive. This is what Life published, an entire page of papers, was just the smallest sampling of the letters that came to the magazine. And people talked in very personal terms about how they were moved by the photo essay and they wanted to reach out and help the Fontenelle family. There's a tragic aftermath. I probably won't have time to get to it, but the tragic aftermath is sort of a metaphor for the limitations of empathy. So there's Gordon Parks. He grew up very, very poor. He was homeless for a while. He was a child in Kansas and spent his young adulthood in Minneapolis. But he was always clear that the kind of poverty he experienced in Kansas and in Minneapolis is very different from the poverty that he later experienced and saw in Harlem. He was also extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily hardworking, and he was also lucky. And from nothing, he created himself. It's a remarkable story. Here he's talking about his mother's death. He was the last of 15 children, but his mother was the glue that held the family together. I think that he was always looking for mother figures in his stories. And in the Harlem family story, he did find a mother figure, but she did not have the capacity to hold a family together in the way that his mother did. Parks, as a young adult, worked in a variety of dead-end jobs, poorly paying jobs. I should have said that he was born in 1912, so he's coming of age during the Great Depression, during the 1930s. Jobs are hard to find, especially for African Americans. The best job he ever held was as a waiter on a railroad dining car. But working as a waiter on a railroad dining car exposed him to a waiter and a porter on a railroad dining car, exposed him to photography, exposed him to magazines like Life, where he saw photography as, the quote here says, a medium of expression, but it was also his way out of poverty. He saw that at the very least, he could open a portrait studio in an African-American neighborhood, perhaps become a photographer for an African-American newspaper, or maybe join the faculty of one of the historically Black colleges or universities in the United States to teach photography. You know, it was a very, very segregated world that he grew up in. And so he could not have imagined that Life magazine would be his ticket to fame and fortune. One thing that's really significant in this quote is that only 2 years into his photographic career, he has a determination to portray the American Negro as he really is. Portray the American Negro as he really is. And that speaks to his early immersion now in a political community of artists. It's a community that, that's Gordon Parks, by the way, in the glasses in the middle, in that, you know, Parks had no money, but he always had very nice clothes. I mean, from the beginning to the end, he was always a very, very, very sharp dresser. But at the Southside Community Arts Center in Chicago, he met Chicago's Black Bohemian left, and it was an extraordinary group of people. Some of these names you've probably heard of, like Langston Hughes and Richard Wright and Horace Caton, the sociologist, and Nat King Cole, the singer, as well as all the artists that are on here. He had never been exposed to this. He had failed to graduate from high school, but all of a sudden he's in this highly politicized and charged intellectual community of the arts. And he's learning from people like Charles White, a fantastic artist who is himself in collections and museums all over the world. Charles White, you know, very young when Gordon Parks was getting to know him, was talking about the distortions, the stereotypes, the caricatures that defined African Americans in American visual culture. And he was denouncing them and saying, in my art, I'm going to do something very different. Charles White also spoke this language that was very common on the artistic left, that I will use my art as a weapon. And Parks picked up on this, that he was determined to use his camera as a weapon against injustice. Well, one of his first breaks was when he went to Washington, D.C. on a fellowship to join the Farm Security Administration documentary project. So within the United States, the FSA photography project is quite well known, and many of the most significant American photographers worked for it for a time during the Depression, during the 30s and into the 40s. This is Parks' probably his most famous photograph. He made it very early in his career, and it has that political edge. It has that that left social realism that he picked up in Chicago. You can see exactly what he's doing. He has an African-American housekeeper, Ella Watson, who holds a job as a housekeeper despite her qualifications. She's African-American, and so housekeeper is the best job that she can get to support herself and her family, even though she's working for the federal government. Well, he's posed her in front of an American flag. And of course, the American flag stands for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, we always quote the Declaration of Independence, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, that promise has never been true for African Americans. And Parks expresses all of that and more in this photograph. Well, at the Farm Security Administration, he learned how to use his camera as a tool of social consciousness, as a weapon against injustice. He talks about it. He wrote many, many memoirs. And so when you see him on the screen here, this is either from an interview that he gave or from one of his four memoirs. He's talking about what the camera can do. I mean, you can't take a picture of a racist and it can mean nothing, because a racist can look like a progressive, right? You know, you can't see anything about that in their face. But what the camera can do is expose the evils of racism, the evils of poverty, by showing the people who had suffered under that. And so that's what he will spend part of his career doing, is knowing that I can't show the bad guys unless they're wearing Ku Klux Klan robes or unless they're burning a cross. They look like everybody else. I can show the suffering. And he wanted to go after empathy, because if he's going to use his camera as a weapon against injustice, He wants to move his audience. And he always had this sense that the audience that needed to be moved were white people. You know, his work was addressed at white people. That photo of Ella Watson was addressed at white people. It was to, you know, sort of shake them by the shoulders and say, you believe in one thing and you act in a completely different way. So this empathy is where he wants to go. Okay, there's another picture of Gordon Parks, and that captures his energy and his charm and his charisma. Unusually, for the time, he was able to join the staff of Life. Now, Life was an immensely prestigious and authoritative magazine that told its stories through pictures. Now, Parks was in the right place at the right time. He was enormously talented. He was a fantastic photographer, and he was entering the profession at just the time when very few African Americans were starting to enter mainstream professions. You know, the famous example in the United States is Jackie Robinson integrating Major League Baseball, the first Black player in Major League Baseball. But you had things like President Harry Truman desegregating the armed forces so that the army was no longer divided between white soldiers and white soldiers, but it was an integrated army. So things like that are happening. And so Life, which saw itself as liberal, even though it was very centrist, hired Parks. And I'm going to go through this very quickly. I just want to show you some examples of what he did. I'm going to show you 3 stories from a single issue of Life magazine, 1952, where first he works with Ralph Ellison, the novelist, to visualize Ellison's famous novel, Invisible Man. He and Ralph Ellison were friends. And so they collaborate on this project. So he's visualizing Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Quite an interesting little photo essay. But he also, in this same issue, he was a very good fashion photographer. It blows my mind every time I see photographs like this. The Gordon Parks, a dark-skinned African-American man, was photographing beautiful young white models in public in 1952, when the United States was still a Jim Crow country, and where having this sort of close contact to white women, this could get you lynched in Mississippi or Alabama. And Parks is nevertheless doing it. And then he photographs a story of Alexander Calder, the great sculptor. So he had a remarkable range. So, but his fame comes from the stories that he did on race and poverty. He became Life magazine's go-to person for the interpretation of African-American life. It starts in 1948, story on the Harlem gang leader, segregation in the South in 1956. Beautiful photographs, powerful photography. Poverty in Brazil, 1961. This is also when he begins to write for Life magazine. That's his text over there on the left. A story on what was called the Black Muslims, now known as the Nation of Islam. And what he does is that he humanizes the Black Muslims who were feared and despised and hated by most white Americans. And he was showing a different side. He and Malcolm X became quite good friends when he was working on this story. Even though they didn't agree with each other, they became very good friends. The subhead here is really shows you how Life positioned Gordon Parks. And so at this point, 1963, Parks had been on the staff for about 14 years, and they're still saying, Gordon Parks, a talented Negro, tells in fiction, fact, and photograph how it feels to be Black. He and Muhammad Ali also became close friends, and Muhammad Ali wrote a poem for Gordon Parks, which Parks quotes in the story that he wrote there. And here's one of the last things that he did for Life on the Panthers. And the Panthers actually offered him a job. They wanted him to be Minister of Propaganda. And he said, no, you can't pay me enough. Literally, he was making a lot of money at Life. Life was a stepping stone. So Life made him famous. He later became a celebrity. the novel here, The Learning Tree, he wrote in 1963, he turned it into a movie. He became the first African-American to direct a Hollywood studio production. He wrote many memoirs. The best is A Choice of Weapons. See, A Choice of Weapons. And he made Shaft. That's his most famous movie. Not his best, but his most famous. So, Harlem Family. Checking the time, and I have none. The Harlem Family, it was motivated by the series of urban uprisings of the 1960s, and it was part of a special issue. And here's Life magazine's editors saying the Negro in the cities constitute the nation's most alarming domestic problem. Life had covered the uprisings in really sensationalized and frankly quite racist ways. This is one spread from 1965. Here's another spread from 1967. I have to say that there were no snipers. You know, a government commission acknowledged that there were no snipers, yet Life and a lot of other media created this idea that there were all these black snipers. So here's Life saying that we begin with a black man's plea to the white community to understand. And here's Parks saying, he wasn't after sharply delineated things the camera can do. He wanted to do something that was moody. And so it's not a narrative, it's a montage. It's not an argument, he's creating a mood. Parks had his own ideas about Harlem. He had lived in Harlem as a very poor young man, briefly in the 1930s. He had lived there with a little more money later, but he never liked Harlem. And that colors his story. You know, he had grown up poor, but he said, this is the kind of poverty I grew up in was real different from Harlem. I mean, I felt alien. And he shared this sense of alienation with his friend, Ralph Ellison, the novelist. Here's Ellison talking about Harlem as the scene and symbol of the Negro's perpetual alienation in the land of his birth. And so just before he started working on the story, here's Parks saying, I went to Harlem and things had changed, but only for the worst. Hot doorways, fetid air, rats gnawing on the walls at night. Had things changed? Yes, but for the worse. So here's that story, and here's that spread again. And let me just show you this. What I want, what I am, what you force me to be is what you are. He's creating this I-you relationship between him and his readers. But that first page, that poetic soliloquy goes on. It says, I am you, staring back from a mirror, poverty and despair, revolt and freedom. Look at me, and to know that to destroy me is to destroy yourself. He's creating that intimate connection, but he holds out his hand. He holds out his hand. We are not so far apart as we might seem. There's something about both of us that goes deeper than blood and deeper than race. He's holding out his hand. If whites will join him, I too am America. America is me. There is yet a chance for us to live in peace. You know, there's the challenge, and then there's holding out the hand. There is creating this vision that we can share a common humanity and a common citizenship. And this is what I'm saying is akin to Ubuntu. So we then enter the photo essay itself with its dark, moody photographs that emphasize the bleakness that creates a claustrophobic atmosphere. And you know, we see Norman Fontanelle here in the window. We can't really get what's going on, but then Parks tells us in his text that the coming of winter had been a bad time. Norman Fontanelle had lost his job. His eyes were always bloodshot. Yes, he did drink. He was a powerfully built man, but defeat was always hanging off of him. The rest of the photographs take us into this dilapidated kind of squalor that the family lives in. There's no heat in the apartment. The plaster is falling off the walls. The landlord pays no attention. The family can't get any help from government programs. We see Bessie Fontanelle on the left trying to be a pillar for her family, but She can't do it. So here's Bessie Fontenelle appears to be a strong woman, especially in the early part of the day. As the day wears on, she ages with it. By nightfall, she has crumbled into herself. All this needing and wanting is driving me crazy. She can't be, for this family, what Parks' mother, Sarah, was for his. And so there is this intense, we hardly ever leave the apartment, this intense claustrophobia and this intense, this kind of bleakness, the apartment it remains a prison of endless filth. And so it feels prison, it's inescapable. And, and this is reinforced by Parks' text, it's reinforced by the photographs. The big photograph on the right is Thanksgiving Day, a day of celebration for Americans, a day when middle-class Americans and affluent Americans celebrate their abundance and all the things they can put on the table. And this family has very little to eat, and they have to heat the apartment with the stove. I'm going to skip over that. And so at the end, we see Norman Sr., the father, sitting on a hospital bed. And he's there because Bessie, the mother, has poured boiling water over him after he beat her. There was violence in the family, and he beat her. And he's on his bed, and the hospital, and he's a broken man. And he says to Parks, "Any other man would have been gone long ago. I would have left the family. A lot of the guys do, but I can't leave. All I want is to be a man." And the very last thing we see is this, and this is Bessie lying on her side, utterly defeated, literally beaten. All she can do is protect her youngest child, Richard. And so Life's readers responded. They responded like this. I'm just going to show you a few. How many wept tears of frustration as I did? Where does one begin? How does one begin? At one time I thought there was hope. Now I'm convinced that this hope is futile. Some were like this, not very many, saying that these people are responsible for their own misery. They're spending their money on alcohol. There's no food for the family. You think that the mother is saintly, but she still poured boiling water on her husband. These people deserve what they get. And he had something like this. Not all of Life's readers were white. And so you have a reader like this sending in, saying he's an African American. And he's saying, why can't you show we're proud? We are proud people. It would be nice for a magazine to show just once the many colored families who do have and strive to maintain a decent place to live. That's really important. He's making an important point because Life rarely covered African Americans, except if they were celebrities or sports heroes, or if they were people like the Fontenelles, or if they were out there rioting, And so he's got a point about representation. But most were like this, most, overwhelmingly. I was impressed by your eloquent story, enclosed as a small contribution to the Fontenelle family. So Parks has created a picture of this family, a family that is decontextualized. We didn't meet their friends. We didn't meet their extended family. We didn't meet their social networks. We don't know if they go to church. He's decontextualized them. He stripped them of agency. At the very end, Norman's in the hospital and Bessie is beaten and broken on her bed. It's an invitation to white saviorism. And so, that way that he opened with that invitation to share something akin to Ubuntu has become something quite different. That saviorism is not a sharing of equality. Saviorism is a reaching down. And so I know that I'm 3 minutes over my allotted time, and I'm going to stop it right there.
Thank you, John. We'll move straight to Luvuyo, then I'll have some remarks. But thank you for a brilliant presentation. So Luvuyo, please. about 25 minutes as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Before I start, I would like just to call my ancestors to guide me. I have water, and so I'm communicating with Mthimkhulu. I was just communicating with my ancestors to speak through me, to assist us in our struggle of decoloniality and all the struggles that we are faced as the dark people in the world. Okay, this is my talk. I'll be talking about the title of my presentation is Towards Re-Africanization, Reflections on Ubuntu and the Philosophy of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. These are the areas that I will cover, the theoretical framework and the key arguments that I'm bringing to the fore, and also end by drawing a link between Ubuntu and the historical evolution of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. Just as a way of giving a background or introducing my subject, there is a lot of text that covers Ubuntu in South Africa. And that the text emphasize different aspects of Ubuntu. In post-1994, the concept of Ubuntu, I argue, has been oversimplified and improperly used to embrace and sustain the notion of rainbow nation and also national reconciliation enterprise. In this populist discourse, Ubuntu philosophy is not intellectually engaged with, and it is used for politics of transition, consolidation of power, and political advancement, as we have witnessed in the 1990s. I submit that this is an essentialized and it de-Africanized the usage of Ubuntu. The present realities in South Africa that relates to gender violence, corruption, and racialized inequality and land ownership, I submit is an antithesis of Ubuntu philosophy. There are different definitions or understanding of Ubuntu that have been submitted, but what I will use for this talk as a definition of Ubuntu, it revolves around what is called the African humanism, togetherness, and the attributes and human attribute that is in harmony with complete being. Because from an Ubuntu point of view, being is not complete if it's just an individual, not in association with others. The attributes of Ubuntu have also been characterized by expressions of concepts like African humanism, especially Ramon's, where he draw analogy between the notion of Ubuntu in Zimbabwe and also in South Africa. We also witness this linkage between Ubuntu and Africanism, and this has also been brought to the fore in an article that was in the newspaper called Diaspora Times, which is based in the States, where Ubuntu was reported as the long-lasting spirit of Africanism. And this is central to the concept of Pan-Africanism within the framework of Ubuntu, is the quest for decoloniality of being, and what some scholars refer to re-Africanization. And this concept of re-Africanization is in line with what Kwame Nkrumah put forward as the African personality that was disturbed by colonialism, slavery, and in South Africa by apartheid. These are theoretical considerations that I use to ground my argument. Is the concept of Africanicity, which was advocated by Mofege, and he used it as a way of challenging or overcoming the discrepancies in social science and also the epistemic domination. And also I use the works of Dwop and Nabudire, especially the concept of Africology, because there are similarities when you zoom through Ubuntu using the lenses of Africology, you will see the link between these. And of course, the works of Edward, in as far as Pan-Africanism, helps to understand the meaning of Ubuntu. And so is the Need Recruit movement. The first area in terms of my main argument is the issue of Ubuntu as African philosophy. I'm not going to go into debate or discussion about whether there is African philosophy, because there is a debate on its own. And most of the time, these tend to go in terms of color line for those who dispute the existence of African philosophy, or they will reduce it to ethnic philosophy. So for the purpose of this talk, I will say the Ubuntu as an African philosophy is different from the Western philosophy because it emphasizes collective identity, communalistic, instead of the individualism or individuality that is common in Western philosophy. And also, it promotes togetherness, a concept which views the sense of self through relation with other people. And if we are following Umangane, he underlines that philosophically, the term Ubuntu emphasizes the importance of a group or community. This is linked to the fact that Ubuntu is not just, or Ubuntu philosophy does not just deal with an individual, but it deals with a community. So there are differences between what is presented as the Western philosophy and also Ubuntu. But following Nabutere's line of thinking in as far as his definition or understanding of Ubuntu, it is important to highlight that for him, it provides Africans a sense of self-identity, self-respect, and achievement. And this, what he called the humanistic value. So as you can see that Ubuntu means different things to different people, and so is this Ubuntu as a philosophy. I submit that Ubuntu is a social accord that is communalistic in orientation, that promotes togetherness, humanity, and collective, and also humanity. One of the scholars that has paid attention on the concept of Ubuntu, Ramos, submits a term that he used to explain the meaning of Ubuntu, which is the cosmic harmony. He's arguing that Ubuntu brings this harmony in the community, this harmony amongst the people, because your view of the complete being is when you are also taking into account other people. The being or an individual is not isolated from others. And also in the article that was in the Guardian newspaper, the definition of Ubuntu there is rooted in this humanistic African philosophy, where the idea of community is one of human blocks of society. Ubuntu is that reveals a concept of common humanity, oneness. So what comes up strongly in this area of Ubuntu as social accord is this oneness, this humanity, and also this harmony, this communist harmony that Ubuntu necessitates of bringing people together. And this has also been observed by one of the former slaves, Edward, when he moved to West Africa, and he then identified or observed certain trends amongst the African communities. And then he also fell in love with this idea of communalistic or based, and this cooperation and the mutual aid. And these are some of the key features of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is multidimensional, and we also use Ubuntu in terms of ethics and also the moral. Ubuntu philosophy has advocated for a community-centeredness ethics attribute. And these are different from the Western understanding of ethics that is more individualistic. And this occurs well with this concept of Ramon of cosmic harmony. And if we take a step back, we look in the ANC Youth League manifesto that was produced in 1944. There were also elements of Ubuntu that came to the fore in terms of what they referred to as ethics at the time, that we combat morals, which relates to the maintenance and upholding high ethical standards ourselves. So the Youth League, the ANC Youth League at that time, also presented a science of Ubuntu in as far as ethics. And it would be important to draw a line or a link between the ANC of 1945 and the people who are in the ruling party now, whether they still uphold these high ethical standards or not. And also, one of the leading Africanists in the 1940s who died at an early age in 1947, Anton Lembede, in the article that he submitted in Ilanga Lase Natal, where he outlined the principles of African nationalism, he viewed this as morality is the soul of society. And he then explained this: if there's no morality or there is a decline in morality, what will happen? And for him, he viewed African nationalism or Africanism as the only weapon or tool that Africans can use. So these are just some of the instances that shows the importance of morality amongst Africans, whether you look at in the political circle or in ordinary cases. And I submit that the lack of morality, ethics, and prevalence of children and women abuse or violence against women, the levels of corruption, which Njabula Ndebele dubbed as the meditating in corruption, because he observed how the levels of corruption are. And also the present racialized inequality and land ownership points to the disturbance of this cosmic harmony. One of the areas that I'm submitting is that if we look at the way Desmond Tutu presented Ubuntu, especially through the TRC, I submit that was the sensationalization of Ubuntu. And that was the liberal way of Ubuntu. And as we will see in the next slide, I'm even arguing that he used Ubuntu to mask the Christian values that he presented for forgiveness and the national reconciliation. In post-apartheid South Africa, Ubuntu is frequently referred to both in political context and also in political context as a means of trying to bring to back the issue of reconciliation, and also in public sector. Recently, there were people who were removed in Somerset West, in Ilwandle, and the Human Rights Commission, in their findings, they declared that the South African road agents lacked Ubuntu when they removed people of that area in winter. So it is common, or it is observable that at some stage, the government officials or even politicians will use the term Ubuntu to reflect or to give weight to certain incidents. But there is no intellectual engagement, or there is no detailed engagement with the term Ubuntu. And this is similar to how Desmond Tutu used Ubuntu during the TRC. And if we look deeper into the proceedings of Ubuntu, contrary to the held view by some about the TRC, it did not bring about justice, restorative humanity, and dignity of the victims of violence. They claimed harmony and restorative justice that the TRC supposedly harnessed and promoted served perpetrators more than the victims. As we all know that the people who appeared before the TRC, most of them did not disclose. We still don't know what happened during apartheid. And most of them, they blame the system, that it was the system, they were not aware. Therefore, the TRC, or the approach that was used by Desmond Tutu and others during the TRC, it sustained this white domination that is visible in South African history, because the conceptualization or the framing of the conceptualization and framing of reconciliation were set by European and Western domination. And this sustained this trend, which has a long history in South Africa. However, the way the TRC proceedings were experienced in South Africa, it was a way of manipulating repression of resentment and anger towards whites in South Africa. And in this context, it is important to take into account that it is difficult to have a national reconciliation without social justice and the land question not resolved, which are central in the racialized inequality. And these are antitheses of the TRC liberal use of Ubuntu. Also here, drawing from Unabudera, in zooming into the issue of reconciliation, he's saying reconciliation, in order to have reconciliation, people must accept the wrongs of the past. And in this context in this South African context, the perpetrators, most of them did not accept the wrongs of the past. And what I submit is the approach that was used by Desmond Tutu in as far as reconciliation was based on Christianity than Ubuntu. But he used Ubuntu as a cover-up for his Christian approach into reconciliation. So this then brings us to the issue of the unfinished business of the past atrocities. So there can never be a reconciliation without a full disclosure of what happened in the past. The configuration of the South African TRC was a construct of Western society style and Christianity as the overarching ideology masked by reference to Ubuntu. This is the point that I just highlighted. The TRC was meant to return to the source following Ame Cabral's argument through using the Ubuntu practice and philosophy. However, the use of Ubuntu and philosophy there was a misapplication and exploitation of the latter to serve the purpose of reconciliation project promoted by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. Some scholars that have written on Ubuntu view Nelson Mandela and also Desmond Tutu as the embodiment and the symbols of Ubuntu. However, this trend does not take into account the tensions and the sensationalism that is evident in this discourse of Ubuntu that is presented by the two. So contrary to the Nelson Mandela euphoria, without the full disclosure of what happened in the past and the socio-economic justice, national reconciliation and forgiveness will not be realized. As we witnessed that during the Nelson Mandela regime administration rather, and also Jacob Zuma, who used Nelson Mandela's reconciliation to legitimize himself, there was never much inroads in as far as reconciliation in South Africa. The statements that have been made recently by the last president of the apartheid regime, F.W. de Klerk, also brings to the fore the argument that I'm making that the way TRC was used, there was no full disclosure. And some people feel like there's nothing wrong that happened in the past. And it is ironical because apartheid was declared as a crime against humanity. So the activities that relate to the operations of apartheid then were not just. This kind of injustice through the National Reconciliation Project was a form of violence in itself. This is my submission, that this was a form of violence itself. The held view of Tato Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu in as far as rainbowism and reconciliation has recently been challenged. And there are the cases that are in court now of people who were the victims of apartheid are some of the incidents that shows this challenging of the dominant narrative. Ubuntu and the historical geography of Pan-Africanism. The concept of Ubuntu, which is an integral part of African philosophy, encapsulates the African worldview, that embodies Africanism. Ubuntu as a concept of resistance against white philosophy is revolutionary and embraces Pan-Africanism. If we follow the origins of Pan-Africanism, especially in the diaspora, it was a way of regrouping and organizing themselves in terms of slavery. There was slavery both in America and also the slavery that was conducted by the Arabs. So it emerged as a way of regrouping. In South Africa, when we give the narrative of Pan-Africanism, it is always presented as if it starts in 1865 through the works of Tiyo Soga. My submission here is to view Nsikane as the pioneer of elements of Pan-Africanism. Nsikane was born in 1780 and he died in 1821. Nsikane made a popular statement before he died that Zenibe Yimbumba Yamanyama. He made this statement that Zenibe Yimbumba Yamanyama. This loosely translated, it means unity amongst Africans and solidarity. So if we follow the development or the evolution of Pan-Africanism, we observed what Nsikane said, unity and solidarity amongst Africans, as these are evident in Pan-Africanism ideology. And as I said, that Soga most of the time is viewed as the pioneer of Black consciousness and also Pan-Africanism, especially his works in 1865. However, as I'm submitting that, if you look at the statement of the works of Nsikane at the time, then you can see that the Pan-Africanism started before that. And remember, Nsikane was serving with Tiyo Soga's father as a councillor of Gagabe. So Tiyo Soga was to some extent influenced by Nsikane because Tiyo Soga left South Africa to Scotland during the Wars of Land Dispossession and studied in Scotland and married a Scottish lady. Then he wrote what he called My Inheritance, because his children in South Africa could be classified or were classified as colours. So he wanted to install to them that even though their mother is white, they should know that they are Black. If we follow the history or the evolution of this concept of Imbumba Yamanyama, we observed that there were organizations that were formed in early as 1882, which promoted this idea of this notion of Black solidarity, Black or African unity and solidarity. And then in 1891, Khubsane formed Ingqungquthela kaKhubsane, which also, it was a political organization that was founded based on solidarity amongst Africans and unity of the continent. I submitted in my other work that the African National Congress was not formed in 1912, rather in 1898. And in this ANC of 1898, we see the elements of Pan-Africanism in as far as this unity amongst the Africans. The missionary newspapers like Sikidimi, the Kefa Express, and many others were used by the intellectuals of by the intellectuals of the time to promote or to also engage on the issues of Pan-Africanism. And so the alternative newspapers like Imvo Zabansundu, and others were used to that. Then there were also cross-pollination of ideas. I won't go in details in as far as other issues, but I just selected some of the key moments. The first Pan-Africanist Congress of 1901, or rather of 1900, organized by Sylvester Williams. There were South Africans who attended it. Alice and also Khubsane were present there. They attended it, and then they came back to South Africa and also continued with the ideas of Pan-Africanism in the same line as the statement that was uttered by Unsikane. We also see this influence of Unsikane to Tema during what he referred to as the New Africa movement. One of the popular statements or speeches that were done by Paisley Kaseme when he was a student at Columbia University in 1906 is what he referred to as regeneration of Africa. And the essence of this regeneration of Africa was about African identity, Africa claiming its space, this re-Africanization that was disturbed by colonialism. And so is the works of Khubsane, who finished the national anthem, Nkosi Sikelel' i-Afrika. You see there the influence of Unsikane. There was a newspaper in 1933 which was called Inkundla Yabantu. This newspaper published the works of Marcus Garvey. And it is the articles that were published in this newspaper that influenced some of the radicals within the ANC Youth League. And this, for instance, that's how we see even the emergence of people like Anton Lembede, who were more Africanist in their orientation, and also still moving or spreading the view of unity amongst Africans. So the African claim that was produced by the ANC in 1943 also had the elements of unity and this Africanness, and so is the ANC Youth League Manifesto of 1944. So the Congress, the Pan-African Congress that was held in Manchester in 1945, which changed the landscape in terms of Pan-Africanism and decolonization on the continent, influenced the evolution of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. And there were interactions between people like George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, and the Africanists at the time who were in South Africa, like Robert Mangaliso Sobuku. So you see then in the 1940s and 50s, the change or the reawakening of race consciousness, which also spread or shared the ideas or the views that were presented by Unsikane. And also the newspaper, the Africanist newspaper that was dominant in the 1950s, it was a platform that was about exchanging ideas in terms of Pan-Africanism. Then in conclusion, Ubuntu is about communal existence based on African being. And as I argued that the way Ubuntu has been presented or depicted by Desmond Tutu during the TRC was a form of violence. It was a race violence, a symbolic violence, personal and social and economic violence. The appropriate practice of Ubuntu philosophy has a potential to significantly contribute towards the re-Africanization movement. It is about cosmic harmony, interdependence, and togetherness, and importance of humanness and African humanism. So this African humanness and African humanism has a long history in terms of the understanding of Ubuntu and the evolution of Pan-Africanism in South Africa. And it is through these terms that we will see the link between the two, between Ubuntu and the history of Pan-Africanism. Lastly, the link between Ubuntu and the concept of Pan-Africanism further amplifies the multidimensional nature of Ubuntu philosophy. Ubuntu philosophy is multidimensional. It cannot be confined in one area. And it is also through this multidimensionality of Ubuntu that we see the links between Ubuntu and the concept of Pan-Africanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Luvuyo. It was brilliant. It was a brilliant discussion, and the chronology as well in that. I think as a remark, I mean, there's already questions coming up in different ways, especially in regards to your presentation, Luvuyo. But I want to start with John's assertion. I think these papers, one way or the other, speak to each other. And I think John's assertion was interesting because you start with the photo that you put by Parks, and you make this assertion that it stripped them of their agency as a family, but made them to be more open to the gaze of white savior. And I think this becomes very interesting in one level. You argue in your paper as well that Gordon used, photography as a medium of expression, a way out of poverty, and wanted to portray African Americans as they are, but yet at the same time, the audience, even though he wants that, the audience that he was appealing to again was the white gaze, the white audience's majority by and large. So you play with these two themes, which are very interesting in trying to understand Park's work, which is interesting in one level. So, I mean, it comes back to this idea. I mean, the ultimate, I think what you're trying to do with his work is like, you're arguing, I think in one level, that he was using his camera as a weapon against poverty and racism. Yet at the same time, this magazine that he found himself that actually saved him, portrayed him as the authentic Black who will speak for the Black majority. So there's something about dehumanization and humanization that you play with. And I think in many levels, that's where the ultimate of this paper is about it. The humanization of an artist who came from poverty, who's trying to humanize himself through his art. And also at one level, the magazine humanized him because it freed him from poverty to fortune. Yet at the same time, and he wants to free his own people and humanize them and portray them differently to a different gaze. But yet at the same time, in the process of this humanization, I think that's what you're arguing, there's a process of dehumanization. And you're tackling with that. And then there's an issue around your paper that I think is trying to struggle with what is the small changes versus the structural changes. The tension between reform and structure, and how do we deal with that? They're trying to think through not only Ubuntu, empathy, but also the ultimate of humanity in these battles. And I don't think, and I think your paper is not far off at all from what Luvuyo just presented in one level. Because Luvuyo is coming from the premise of saying Ubuntu, the way it's been mainstream at this moment, it's so simplified. But he wants the return of an African humanism, the togetherness that is not from, it's against the resistance against individuality of the Western concept. That's his premise. And I think you start from that, Luvuyo, and you are against the Western concept and you're advocating for collectiveness, but collectiveness not in a reconciling unity Christian way, but you're politicizing it back. You're returning to the politicization. And how do you return to the politicization? Through Pan-Africanism. And you walked us through the processes of Pan-Africanism and what is it actually, the lineage of it. But yet you have this tension in that when you walk through that Pan-Africanism, which is important in our history and the intellectual work that comes with that, is that at the same time it's tainted. There's a unity, there's a mainstream, but it's tainted also by the past. So how do we think through Pan-Africanism without taintedness? How do we return to the past of Pan-Africanism without this tainted past at the same time? This tension that exists between them. So overall, I think both your papers actually speak to each other. I think they speak to each other in terms of the form, as I said, and structure. But how does this structural, and I think both of you are trying to advocate for a structural like change, but how does it look like in a very tainted context? In the case of John, in terms of the African Americans who are alienated, that's the word that you use. Yet at the same time, they want to portray themselves in one level. The racist context, in the South African context in many ways, which is also very racist. It's like, how do we understand the structural reform in terms of like the trueness, like the African way, the return of Africanism, of humanity and Ubuntu and humanization. And then there's a question around, you know, this notion of Blackness in empathy or Ubuntu. There's a question of Africanism and how it manifests itself in terms of like finding humanity. How do we tackle those two things? So I think it's an issue around structure, but also it's about how do we then think about individualism in relation to collectiveness. I think both of you are speaking to that in one level. As an artist through Pan-Africanism, one way or the other. There's an aspect of like, you wanna find the individual, the individuality in someone, but at the same time, you wanna find the collectiveness, but also you wanna find the collectiveness that can manifest itself in allowing or enabling individuality. How do we do that? And I think both your papers is trying to wrestle with it in the search for Ubuntu, in a search for bigger change, not small change, but bigger change in different artistic form or through the ideas of Pan-Africanism. And I think I'll leave it there as part of the questions. And I will read 3 more questions and then we can answer it collectively, I think, if that's okay. I saw a few. Mujadi, you will help me. So what we're gonna do with this is like, if people wanna write questions down, they can do it on the chat or on the Q&A. And if you wanna verbally ask a question, then you have to raise your hand. Then hopefully Mujadi and Open or anybody else, Nicole, can help me if people raise their hands and I don't see them. But I'll start with the written questions. Where the question? So here. Okay. Lucas is just thanking you, Dr. Dondolo. You made a very striking fundamental assertion about the process of TRC was based on Christianity instead of the principle of Ubuntu. Can you please explain how did this affect the outcome of the TRC and how it still disadvantaged South Africans? That's you guys asking that, Luvuyo. And then Mabutu is asking, Doug, where do you locate the Natal Native Congress of the 1900s, founded by Msani? So it's for you, Luvuyo. Most people are thanking you. And the last question, Luvuyo, again, is like, how do we relying on the principle of Ubuntu arrive at restorative justice and in truth and reconciliation in South Africa? So yeah, like the same person as well, because he says, I come across a document termed Ubuntu Foreign Policy from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, South Africa. So I don't know if you wanna ask, and answer those questions, Luvuyo, while I look for other questions for John in between.
Okay. The outcomes of the TRC. perhaps we need to take a step back to look at the act that paved the way for the formation of the TRC. There was a mandate that was given and the specific timeframes that we're going to look into. The outcomes of the TRC then promoted, as I argue, that they promoted this forgiveness. And it's also a challenge that we even experience now, this get over it. You know, most white South Africans, they always say, why Black people or Africans can't just get over apartheid, get over of what happened. You can't move that far without knowing what happened in the past and taking into account the impact of those actions of the past. So the outcomes of the TRC are in this mood of reconciliation. And also, they are, my submission is this was caught up in this Mandela euphoria in the 1990s up to I think 1999 when Thabo Mbeki came in, because Thabo Mbeki defined himself away from some of the principles or values that Tata Nelson Mandela stood for. So we see then these outcomes of the TRC in as far as forgiveness. There are people who, like Votari, like many other people, some went to prison, were imprisoned, others were given amnesty. But if you look on the issue of amnesty, you realize that most people who were given amnesty were the perpetrators who also did not disclose much. So the issue of the findings of the TRC is still debatable or is viewed differently by South Africans, especially if you look at the activities that were conducted. For instance, the issue of the activities of one military wing viewed as legitimate, and then the activities of another political formation viewed as racially motivated. So the outcomes of the TRC are diverse, but in essence, they are more promoting reconciliation and togetherness. And another aspect of this outcome is the issue of memorialization, because some of the victims they then wanted to have something to commemorate certain events. You talk of Gugulethu 7, people who were killed in Gugulethu. The victims there, or the relatives of the victims, wanted to have something. So TRC also influenced the direction of memorialization in South Africa, as I just highlighted. But it is not an outcome that we can say it changed the face of South Africa, because, as I said, there's still this issue of get over it. And then the Natal Native Congress, yes, it was part of that, but it also stood for some of the values that I highlighted. And also there were these newspapers like Ilanga la Natal and many others that were used as a platform for discussion. So in some areas, you find that there was perhaps an organization, but most of the debate or discussion or the discussions were taking place in a public discourse through newspapers where people will discuss a number of issues. So I think it also forms part of that history of the evolution of the concept of Pan-Africanism. And then the issue of I didn't get the question on the restorative justice. Because that's what TRC or Desmond Tutu advocated, that they were promoting restorative justice, which is associated with African thinking. But as Naputera said, that you can't move for restorative justice if you are not disclosed or you have not accepted the deeds of the past. So there was a step that we missed, and then we just fast forward to talk about restorative justice, whereas there are other aspects that were not taken care of in terms of full disclosure and also the broader psyche of the society. So there were no material changes. There are no material changes that we can point as a result of TRC. And also the restorative justice, the use of restorative justice through TRC, it does not take into account, or it did not take into account some of the fundamentals of this restorative justice, which relates to disclosure, and also yes, relate to disclosure. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Luvuyo, for that. I noticed there are some people who made indications that they want to speak verbally as well. But before that, I don't know, John, if you can respond to some of my remarks in terms of thinking about parks in terms of that. But also there's another question here in the process of it. It says, thank you, Prof. Mason. With regards to Park's contribution in film, will there be parallels between his work and those of Tyler Perry in terms of covering the Black experience from the perspective of Black pathology, unquote? So I don't know if you can tackle the two sort of like together, then we can proceed to the next section.
You know, you don't have to read very deeply into the literature on Ubuntu to see that people often draw Martin Luther King into the conversation, and they draw parallels between Martin Luther King's notion of a beloved community and Ubuntu. And it's you know, and the kind of vision of Ubuntu as a beloved community certainly ties in very neatly with the Desmond Tutu's ideas about what Ubuntu means. Because after all, Martin Luther King and Desmond Tutu are both clergy, are both ministers, are both Christian ministers, and Christianity was at the very core of Martin Luther King's beloved community, and at the very core of Tutu's ideas of Ubuntu. And of course, they are both liberal. You know, they are both very liberal, and they are both non-racial, right? So they stand in opposition to a Pan-Africanist reading of Ubuntu. And I think Parks would have embraced that. You know, if Gordon Parks were here, he died about a decade ago, but if he were here, he would be attracted by the Tutu version of Ubuntu. He would be attracted by that idea of a non-racial community, a beloved non-racial community of equals. And I think that's what the kind of thing that he was offering. And when he wrote that poetic opening soliloquy in A Harlem Family, you know, Ubuntu is, I've been thinking about it and reading about it. I will not write about it, but it's an interesting word because it is a word that is contested, and it's contested as fiercely as the word freedom is in the United States, right? So freedom is a big word in the United States, but to put it in crude terms, freedom is something that white Americans think they have and that Black Americans want, right? So there is this fundamental, you know, tension over the word freedom, and I think there's this tremendous tension over the word Ubuntu in South Africa. Charity versus structure. Just say very, very briefly that Parks was influenced very heavily by a number of different thinkers. One of them was the African-American sociologist Kenneth Clark. Kenneth Clark did see the ghetto, as it was called, you know, the poor African-American neighborhoods like Harlem, were in the 60s routinely called the ghetto. He saw the ghetto as something that created pathologies, created individual and social pathologies. But Clark always insisted that the root cause is white supremacy. The root cause is racial oppression. The root cause is segregation. You know, the root causes are external. And that's one thing that you don't see in A Harlem Family, right? You see the pathology, but you don't see what's creating it, the ultimate causes. And, you know, and here Parks was out of step with, I think, mainstream thinking within the Black community, whether we're talking about Martin Luther King, who by by 1967 and 1968, Martin Luther King was talking about the need for a revolution of values, a revolution of thinking, of profound structural changes in American society. And needless to say, on the left, with groups like the Black Panthers, you had people who were literally calling for a revolution. So there was a discourse about structural change, whether it was the liberal version of Martin Luther King's or the radical version of the Black Panthers, and so many other voices who were there. And Parks, by ignoring that in a Harlem family, I think was out of step with a lot of the discourse within the Black community.
Thank you for that. I see if, hopefully I do not butcher your name, Hafiz, I think. You wanted to make a remark verbally. Can you do that now, if possible?
Hello.
Hi, sorry. Have you pronounced your name properly? Sorry.
So can I talk? This is Nyaka. Can I?
Okay. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
We can.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you. I saw your program just a couple of, that's just yesterday. A friend of mine sent me the link. And then I am at Lincoln University, and my friends and I will be launching a movement called the Convention for Pan-Africanism and Progress. And then, so because we do work on Ubuntu, so we have interest in being here with you guys. So I listened to Dr. Dondolo, and then of course I learned a lot. But I have a few things, that I wanted to raise, and I will not be long. I have the feeling that he did not give, despite what he can think about what Mandela and Desmond Tutu did, and how they may not have worked towards restorative justice when they were doing Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. But the legitimacy and the credibility that Ubuntu gained, like on the international scene, I think we can at least acknowledge that it is due to Mandela because he is a Nobel Peace Prize. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Peace Prize, and because of their position in the society, somehow they contributed to make people accept the Ubuntu philosophy. So that is the first comment. Second, Thabo Mbeki spoke about Ubuntu, and then also he promoted another aspect of Pan-Africanism, African Renaissance, but I've not seen Dondolo to talk about that. So I would like him, to comment on those two things.
Okay, thank you. Is there anybody else? Anybody wants to ask a question? While we wait, Philippe, I think, has asked a question. Let me look for it. To Luvuyo again, saying when you refer to Africanism or African philosophy, African worldview, and the concepts like African personality that Nkrumah mentioned, are you not generalizing about the value and belief systems of Africans? In other words, how do you reconcile your reference to those expressions with the fact that the African continent is made up of people of diverse ethnic and racial groups with thousands of distinct cultural practices, lifestyle, language, and religion? And then for Mabutu, again, just mentions again to John that you haven't answered his question or her question, saying that with regards to Park's contribution in the film, where would there be parallels between his work and those of Tyler Perry in terms of covering the Black experience and from the perspective of Black pathology? He says you haven't answered that. Can you please do that? And then there's another question from Penny, I found John's presentation fascinating. Just a little question as you were presenting, unrelated, is whether there was any family connections to Rosa Parks between, I guess, Gordon and Rosa Parks. Yeah, that's where things are at this point. I think John, this time, can you start maybe answering the connection between Tyler Perry and Parks in terms of the black, and then the Rosa Parks question as well.
Yeah, are we talking about Tyler Perry, the filmmaker?
Yes. I think that's what he's referring to.
Oh. No, there's no connection. There's no connection. Tyler Perry is making pure entertainment, often comedic pure entertainment. I think it would be a stretch to put them into the same conversation as far as Parks' photo essays for Life magazine are concerned. It would be a different story if we're talking about Parks' films. I think you could really draw some interesting connections between Tyler Perry's films and Gordon Parks' films, starting with the fact that Gordon Parks was the first African-American to direct a Hollywood studio production. He opened the door for filmmakers like Spike Lee and Tyler Perry. However, I'm not writing about his films, so I'm going to leave that question. And a short answer to the question about Rosa Parks, because I really want to get back to those really challenging questions about Ubuntu for my co-panelist. But sadly, Rosa Parks and Gordon Parks are not related.
Luvuyo, those are the questions, but the last question for you, which is also, but I think it's in a different way, relates to also John in a different way. How Ubuntu philosophy and concept can be used as an ideology in Pan-Africanism of the 21st century? That's another question. So encompassing that, I think John, in a different way, you can answer in terms of like thinking through empathy in the moment now. How would Parks sort of answer this moment if you have to put it, put him in this context right now, I think. But Luvuyo, let's start with the questions that were asked already.
Yes, on the issue of African Renaissance, Ubuntu and Thabo Mbeki, in my full paper, I do include that, and also the difference in how the African Renaissance earlier was viewed and the acceptance of the African Renaissance that was advocated by Thabo Mbeki by the Western countries, and look at why was it accepted and why the earlier ones were not. So I do have that in my paper. And then the issue, I'm not saying the contributions that were made by Tatu Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela, or I'm not denying their contribution and saying they didn't play a part. They did. And perhaps it was the situation at the time that forced them to take those decisions. And also, I'm using Nelson Mandela as the face of the ANC at the time and the state president. So this is a collective issue that relates to the ruling party, the thinking of the ruling party at the time. But he was just the face of it. But the assertion that I'm making is their use of Ubuntu was liberal. And Ubuntu was substituted with Christian values. And hence now some of the issues that we are faced with, for instance, the issues of social cohesion. It is difficult. I always say that in South Africa, it's a group of people living together. We are not a nation. There's nothing in South Africa that defines us as a nation. In my view, there's no South Africanness. And one of the contributing factors is some of the steps or the decisions that we made at the early stages of our democracy. So their presentation of Ubuntu, in my view, was liberal. And this is also because of that, that we then have the struggle for the meaning, or the struggle for the meaning of Ubuntu, where you find that for certain people, they started to challenge them and give a different narrative of Ubuntu. But I'm not writing off their contribution. I'm not generalizing when I'm using African personality, because what you also need to understand when you talk about Pan-Africanism, some of these ideas were not new. You look at the concept of Pan-Africanism, rather of African personality. Kwame Nkrumah popularized it in the 20th century. But if you look at in the 1800s, Edward, the former slave that I referred to, who moved to West Africa, he was the first to talk or to coin the term of African personality. But then Kwame Nkrumah reconfigured it. And so as if you look at some in South Africa, the concept that were advocated by people like Anton Lembede. And perhaps it is important to say that, yes, I acknowledge that on the African continent, there are different ethnic groups. And it is exactly on that note that individuals like Anton Lembede promoted Africanness, because these ethnic groups were also, ethnicity rather, was also used in South Africa and in other parts of the continent as part of divide and rule, where you find that ethnic groups were set against each other by the colonizers. So they viewed the issues of ethnicity as being used to sustain the colonial and apartheid government. Hence, in this case, Anton Lembede promoted more of Africanism. And also these individuals who subscribed to Pan-Africanism, they viewed themselves as Africans more than their ethnic groups. And it was just a way of moving away from these issues of divide and rule that I alluded to. And also we need to take into account that the colonial boundaries, the boundaries that we found on the African continent are colonial. And they are emanating from the Berlin Conference. Most of them emanate from the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85. And if you look in some countries, for instance, in Zimbabwe, you find that the language and the cultural practices of, especially the cultural practices in people in the north of, in Limpopo, and people in Zimbabwe, and some people in Zimbabwe, there are similarities. So, and same as the so-called Bantu language. So that shows that at some point, there was a free movement of people, but because of these colonial boundaries, we were then put into these areas that we call ourselves the countries like South Africa and many others. So we also need not to lose sight of that. And the concept of Africanism and Pan-Africanism, it was also a way of challenging this nativism approach that was used in Africa. The nativism approach where natives were defined, or Africans were defined by geography and space, whereas white people were defined by history. So what this was doing in essence, Africans had no, they were presented as, Africans were presented as if they didn't have history. And this nativeness was reconstructed in the sense that in South African context, we had the so-called homelands, Bophuthatswana for the Tswana speaking. In the Eastern Cape, we had Transkei and Ciskei, which was based on language and nothing more. And that was also, and in the case and the KwaZulu, that was based on this nativity, which was more of trying to divide and rule. And hence you find that even some political organizations, they use ethnicity. For instance, the history of the IFP, Inkatha Freedom Party. Mangosuthu used Zulu ethnicity to mobilize the Zulus and the history of Ushaka Zulu as a way of mobilizing party. Those kind of politics, they exclude other people. So the ideology of Pan-Africanism is more appealing to most people because it goes beyond the ethnic line. The relevance of Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism in the 21st century. My take is if we take a step back and look at some of the issues that these intellectuals that coming from the Pan-Africanist tradition and the politicians are fighting for, they are not, they are still a challenge. For instance, the issue of decoloniality. Sobukwe made a speech in 1949 that Fort Hare should be Africanized it should be a barometer of African thought. You look at it, the decoloniality. These Africanists, they spoke about the decolonialization and Africanization of education on the continent. And as we all know that we still have a long way to go in as far as Africanizing the curriculum and also to make these institutions the barometers of African thought. So those ideologies or the thinking of the time is still relevant even now, as long as we have not achieved or move from what they stood for or from what they fought for. I think they are still relevant. And when it comes to Ubuntu, you see, we should not present culture and Ubuntu as static. Culture is dynamic. Culture is changing. But there are certain values of any culture that are a core. So in this case, there are certain aspects, the Ubuntu constitute that. And I don't think we need to modify it or to change it to make it too liberal. So Ubuntu is relevant as long as we have people who will abuse women, as long as we have gender issues, as long as we have racialized inequality, as long as we have the unresolved land question in South Africa. Because it is ironical that in South Africa, we will view corruption in politics, whether in public sector and also in business, as something bad, immoral, but we don't see anything immoral about the land being owned by the minority and the majority living in squalor areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Luvuyo. There's tension here about the issue around ethnicity. Because one of committee says ethnicity has been used to tribalize and maintain colonialism, and many Africans, we are still trapped in that cage. But I'm not gonna go because of the time issues. I'll give you like 2 minutes to speak about it. But in relation to what I asked John, one of the people was asking is the notion of Pan-Africanism not dated or updated, irrelevant for today's youth? Globalism and internationalism seems to be more mainstream, especially in light of the emerging global movement. For instance, borders in South Africa are a contentious issue. Like America, many African nations see the country as a destination for economic opportunities. However, many Blacks in South Africa support hard borders and controlling migration, an ideal in stark contrast to the ideals of Pan-Africanism. But I mean, like, overall, it's like trying to, like, at this moment, for me, I think, John, to locate Park's work to the current, especially what's happening in the US. What would, your imagination of how he respond to this current moment? What photos would he actually, photo essay would he have at this moment, and think about the alienation of Blackness in that level? So I think as a closing remarks as well, thinking about it in those terms.
Sure. You know, I've been thinking about sort of the absence of Ubuntu in the United States. So if you want to find people using the word and using the concept in the United States, the best place to look is in liberal Christian churches. And not surprisingly, it is Tutu's vision of Ubuntu that has been very attractive to liberal Christians and has been embraced by liberal Christians in the United States. And so you'll hear it evoked in its Christian iteration, right? That, and you'll hear priests and ministers and preachers talk about Ubuntu as a particularly African manifestation of the Christian gospel. And because of that, it has not attracted attention from Black Lives Matter activists. You know, the young activists that we saw throughout last summer who were generating protests and marches and demonstrations across the country, because they associate it with liberalism, right? They do not associate it with progressive values, because the only version of Ubuntu we know in the United States is that Tutu-esque version. And so if the Pan-Africanist version that we've just been hearing, if that vision of Ubuntu crosses the Atlantic, I think it would have a great deal of attraction for progressive activists, right? For activists who are Black and on the left, because Pan-Africanism lives, you know? Pan-Africanism, as everybody knows, has a long history on this side of the ocean. I mean, after all, Marcus Garvey had the largest Pan-Africanist organization ever to exist. Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica. And we can't think of Pan-Africanism without thinking about people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Edward Blyden. And so it's a long history. I really hope that an alternative, a progressive vision of Ubuntu can be popularized in the United States. It hasn't been. I think most Americans, most African Americans, would be very surprised to hear what I just heard about Ubuntu. But I think it would be really wonderful, and it would broaden our vision. To get back to Parks, as I said earlier, he would be very attracted by Tutu's vision and Mandela's vision of Ubuntu. That would be his, because he was a man who had great racial pride, but he was never a man, except for a short period of time in his life, he was not a man of the left. And he was, after all, a man who had become immensely successful within the existing structure of American society. And so he was not predisposed to think about large structural change. And so he was comfortably liberal, and I'll leave it at
that. Thank you so much. Like, I guess like in one level, again, your papers sit so closely together, because what you argue in Luvuyo, again, it's like the idea that the problem with like how we post 1994, how like Ubuntu has been articulated through the liberal game. And then what is it? From Parks's idea is that he was a liberal. He was the man of the Tutus. So they were not far off, even though they live in different times, in different history. They were actually not far off. Yet at the same time, I think both the Tutus as well as Parks, they wanted to liberate or emancipate in one level the Black people in one level. So your papers in different contexts, I think they still very much speak to each other. And John uses empathy, you're using the radical Pan-Africanist notion of Ubuntu. But I think it's similar in various ways. So thank you so much for this great debate. And the debate is going on. I mean, on the chat as well, it's been some provocative comments have been made. I'm not going to go through them because of the time issues. But I'd like to also thank, the people, the audience who joined us this afternoon or this morning. Our third webinar on the Ubuntu series is happening on the 10th of November. So please watch out for all the details. We'll send the notification. Please do join us on the 10th of November for another provocative and very thought-provoking understanding of Ubuntu from different vantage points. And it's always great to see, the American using our theoretical concepts to actually understand the lived experiences, and us giving them the theory for the first time. So that's always wonderful to see. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Luvuyo. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, Nicole, for organizing this, and everybody else who's been behind the scenes. And really also to Bongani and Jamie for having this vision. And this is decolonization in practice, as I say. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day, enjoy your evenings. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Luvuyo. That was an excellent paper. That was, I learned a lot from that.
Okay.
Yeah,
no.
It was really
Thanks
good.
to you,
Really
to your paper was interesting, and it just reminded me of visual history. There is one of the leading visual historians, Patricia Hayes. Yes,
I know her well.
You know her well. Yeah. You just reminded me of her, the way you presented your paper and the issues that you are covering. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Patricia is a wonderful historian, so that's high praise. Thank you very much.
Okay. No. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I have a much more sophisticated understanding of Ubuntu, which I will take into the classroom the next time I talk about it, which will be very soon.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's fine.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. I appreciate it. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Welcome.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
Bye.